What happens when a Hollywood star sits down for what should be a simple interview and gets ambushed by one of daytime television's most controversial hosts? In just 29 seconds of blistering confrontation, Sonny Hostin's smugness would completely unravel, leading to one of the most jaw-dropping walkouts in talk show history. Mark Wahlberg walked onto The View, set that morning with a smile, ready to talk about his latest film project. He waved to the audience, shook hands with the panel, and settled into his seat. The energy felt good. The crowd was excited. Everything seemed normal. But normal wasn't going to last long. The first few minutes went smoothly. Whoopi asked about his training routine for the movie. Joy cracked a joke about his early morning workouts. Mark laughed along, telling stories about waking up at 3 a.m. to hit the gym. The audience loved it. They always did. Mark had that everyman charm that connected with people. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. Then Sonny leaned forward. "So, Mark," she started, her voice dripping with a tone that immediately shifted the room's atmosphere. "Let's talk about your past." Mark's smile faded, just slightly. He nodded. "Sure, what about it?" "You've had quite the journey from your troubled youth in Boston to where you are now," Sonny continued, but there was something in the way she said it. Something that wasn't sitting right. "Some would say you've benefited enormously from a system that doesn't offer the same second chances to everyone." The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension building like a storm cloud rolling in. Mark shifted in his seat. "I've never hidden my past, Sonny. I made mistakes when I was a kid. Serious mistakes. I've owned up to them. I've worked every day since then to be a better person, to give back to my community, to be a good father and husband." "But don't you think," Sonny pressed, her eyebrows raised in that way that made it clear. She thought she had him cornered. "That you've gotten opportunities that others with similar backgrounds, particularly people of color, would never receive? That your privilege allowed you to simply move past your crimes while others remain incarcerated for far less?" Mark took a deep breath. His jaw tensed. "I spent time in jail, Sonny. I paid my debt to society. I was a kid who made terrible choices, and I've spent decades trying to make up for that. I mentor kids from troubled backgrounds. I've donated millions to youth programs in Boston. I work with former inmates trying to get their lives together. What more do you want from me?" Sonny leaned back with a slight smirk. "I'm just asking the questions our viewers want answered, Mark. No need to get defensive." "I'm not defensive," Mark replied, his voice steady, but you could hear the frustration creeping in. "I'm explaining my life to you. There's a difference between having a conversation and being attacked." "Attacked?" Sonny laughed, actually laughed, looking at her co-hosts as if to say, "Can you believe this guy? Asking you to acknowledge your privilege is hardly an attack, Mark." Whoopi tried to jump in. "Maybe we should move on to..." But Sonny wasn't done. "You know what I find interesting, Mark? You want credit for all the charity work, all the mentoring, but you get uncomfortable the moment someone asks you to really examine how you got where you are." Mark's face was reddening now. Not from embarrassment, but from anger. Controlled anger, but anger nonetheless. "I'm not uncomfortable examining anything, Sonny. I've examined my life plenty. I know exactly where I came from and how hard I've worked to get here. Every single day. Nobody handed me anything." "Really?" Sonny's voice went up an octave, theatrical and mocking. "Nobody handed you anything. So your whiteness had nothing to do with Hollywood giving you chance after chance. Your maleness had nothing to do with you becoming one of the highest paid actors while women make a fraction of what you do?" "Here we go," Mark muttered, shaking his head. "Here we go what?" Sonny shot back. "Here we go with facts. Here we go with reality. Here we go with you making this about everything except what it's actually about," Mark said, his voice rising slightly. "I came here to talk about a movie. A movie, Sonny. Not to be lectured by someone who sits in a comfortable studio and judges everyone else's life choices. The audience gasped. You could hear it ripple through the room. Sonny's mouth dropped open. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Mark continued, the floodgates now open. "You sit here every day and tear people down. You make assumptions about people's lives, their struggles, their journeys, and you package it all up as social justice. But what are you actually doing? What are you actually contributing, besides hot takes and divisiveness?" "I am using my platform," Sonny said, her voice sharp as a knife, "to speak truth, to power. Something you clearly can't handle." "Truth to power?" Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Sonny, you are the power. You're on national television. You get paid millions to share your opinions. You have security, success, influence. And you use it to what? Make a guy feel bad about turning his life around? To suggest that any success I've had is somehow illegitimate because of my skin color or my gender?" "That's not what I said," Sonny protested. "That's exactly what you said," Mark fired back. "You can dress it up in academic language all you want, but that's what you meant. And you know what? I'm tired of it. I'm tired of people like you, who've never walked in my shoes, telling me how easy I've had it." Sonny's face was turning red now, too. "People like me? What does that mean, Mark?" "It means people who assume they know everything about someone based on a narrative they've constructed in their head," Mark explained, his voice getting louder with each word. "You don't know. Me, Sonny. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know the work I've put in. You don't know the guilt I've carried. You don't know the nights I couldn't sleep thinking about the people I hurt. You don't know any of it. But you feel entitled to sit there and judge me anyway." "I am entitled to ask questions," Sonny snapped back. "That's literally my job." "Your job is to have conversations," Mark countered, "not to prosecute people. There's a difference between asking tough questions and just being mean-spirited. And right now, you're being mean-spirited." The other hosts were looking at each other, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. The audience was completely silent. This had gone way past normal television tension. This was real. This was raw. Sonny straightened in her chair, trying to regain her composure. "I think you're being overly sensitive, Mark. If you can't handle scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." "There it is," Marky said, pointing at her. "There's that smug superiority. That's what I'm talking about. You think because you've decided you're on the right side of every issue that you can talk to people any way you want. You can dismiss their feelings. You can minimize their experiences. And if they push back, well, they're just being too sensitive." "I didn't minimize anything," Sonny insisted, but her voice was getting defensive now. "You absolutely did," Mark said. "You minimized everything I've done to change my life. You minimized the accountability I've taken. You minimized the work I do to help others. All of it. Because in your worldview, I'm just a privileged white guy who doesn't deserve what he has. That's the box you put me in the second I sat down." Sonny opened her mouth to respond, but Mark kept going. "And the worst part? The absolute worst part is that you do this in the name of justice, in the name of equality. But what you're really doing is creating more division, more resentment, more anger. Because you can't just let people be human. You can't let someone have made mistakes and learned from them. You can't let someone's story be complicated. It has to fit your narrative, or it doesn't count." "That is completely unfair," Sonny said, her voice shaking slightly with anger. "I have dedicated my career to fighting for marginalized communities." "By attacking people who are trying to do better?" Mark asked. "By making everything about race and gender even when it's not? By assuming the worst about people's intentions? That's your idea of fighting for justice?" "You don't get to tell me how to fight for justice," Sonny shot back, her finger pointing across the table. "You don't get to sit there with all your privilege and tell me that I'm divisive for pointing out inequality." Mark stood up. Just stood right up out of his chair. The whole studio froze. "You know what, Sonny? You're right about one thing. I don't get to tell you how to do your job. And you don't get to tell me how to live my life or how to feel about my journey. So I'm done here." "You're leaving?" Sunny asked, and there was something in her voice now. Something that sounded almost like panic. She hadn't expected this. "Yeah, I'm leaving," Mark said, unhooking his microphone. "I came here to have a conversation, not to be put on trial by someone who's already decided I'm guilty. Life's too short for this." Whoopi stood up quickly. "Mark, come on. Let's just take a breath here." But Mark was already moving toward the edge of the set. "I appreciate you trying, Whoopi. I really do. But I'm not going to sit here and be disrespected. I don't care how big the platform is." "This is ridiculous," Sunny called out, but her voice had lost its edge. Now she just sounded flustered. "You're going to walk off because I asked you tough questions?" Mark stopped and turned back to face her. "You didn't ask me tough questions, Sunny. Tough questions come from a place of curiosity, of wanting to understand. What you did was come at me with accusations disguised as questions. And then, when I defended myself, you acted like I was the problem. So yeah, I'm walking off. Not because I can't handle tough questions, but because I can handle being treated with basic respect, and that's clearly not happening here." The audience was still dead silent. A few people looked like they wanted to clap, but weren't sure if they should. "Mark, please," Joy tried, her voice softer than usual. "Let's just reset, and—" "There's nothing to reset," Mark said, shaking his head. "This is who she is. This is what this show has become, and I want no part of it." Sunny stood up now too, her face flushed. "Fine. Leave. Run away. That's what people do when they can't defend their privilege." Mark actually laughed at that. A real, genuine laugh, but there was no humor in it. You just can't help yourself, can you? Even now. Even as I'm leaving. You have to get that last shot in. You have to make sure everyone knows that you think you won. "I'm not trying to win anything," Sunny protested. "Yes, you are," Mark said quietly, but firmly. "That's all you're ever trying to do. Win the argument. Prove you're right. Make the other person look bad. It's not about conversation. It's not about understanding. It's about winning. And you know what? You can have this win, Sunny. Congratulations. You ran off a guest. I hope it was worth it." He started walking again. "Your publicist is going to hear about this," Sunny called out, and there was a desperate quality to her voice now, like she knew this had gotten away from her, but didn't know how to fix it. Mark stopped one more time. "My publicist already knows what kind of person I am, Sunny. And after today, everyone watching knows what kind of person you are. So we're good." And with that, he walked off the set. Just walked right off. The cameras didn't know what to do. They bounced between Sunny, who was standing there looking shocked and angry and maybe a little embarrassed, and the empty chair where Mark had been sitting, and the confused faces of the other hosts. Whoopi tried to salvage it. "Well, that was unexpected. We're going to take a quick break and—" But you could barely hear her over the murmuring of the audience. People were talking to each other, looking at their phones, processing what they'd just witnessed. Sunny sat back down, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to compose herself. She looked at the camera with a forced smile. "When we come back, we'll discuss why some people can't handle being held accountable." But even as she said it, you could see it in her eyes. She knew. She knew that spin wasn't going to work. She knew that what just happened was going to be everywhere within minutes. She knew that trying to paint herself as the victim here wasn't going to land. Because everyone had just watched the whole thing unfold. They'd seen her needling, her smugness, her refusal to back down even when things were clearly going south. They'd seen Mark try to engage, try to explain, try to have an actual conversation, and they'd seen him finally decide he'd had enough. Joy leaned over and whispered something to Sunny, but Sunny just shook her head, staring straight ahead. The stage manager was frantically talking into his headset. The audience was still buzzing, and somewhere backstage, Mark Wahlberg was probably already in a car heading anywhere but there. It had all fallen apart so fast. What started as a routine celebrity interview had turned into a full-blown confrontation. And unlike the carefully scripted drama that usually filled daytime television, this had been real, uncomfortably, undeniably real. Sunny had come into this, thinking she was going to make a point, thinking she was going to use her platform to hold someone accountable, to speak truth, to educate. But she'd miscalculated badly. She'd mistaken aggression for journalism. She'd mistaken self-righteousness for justice. And she'd completely failed to recognize when she'd crossed the line from tough interviewer to outright bully. Mark, for his part, had shown remarkable restraint for as long as he did. He'd tried to answer. He'd tried to explain. He'd tried to find common ground. But there's only so much anyone can take before they decide their dignity is worth more than playing along. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, you could see Sunny immediately turn to her producers, talking rapidly, gesturing, probably already trying to figure out how to control the narrative, how to make this look like it wasn't her fault. But the internet doesn't care about narrative control. Within minutes, clips would be circulating. Within an hour, it would be trending. Within a day, think pieces would be written. And no amount of spin was going to change what millions of people had seen with their own eyes. Sunny Hostin had pushed too hard, assumed too much, and refused to recognize a human being sitting across from her. She'd been so focused on making her point that she'd forgotten the basic rules of conversation. Listen, respect, try to understand. And Mark Wahlberg had reminded her, and everyone watching, that nobody has to sit there and take disrespect. Not for a paycheck, not for publicity, not for anything. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful thing you can do. Not because you can't handle the heat, not because you're running from accountability, but because you know your worth, and you refuse to let someone treat you as less than human just because they have a microphone and an agenda. The View would go on after that commercial break. They'd bring out another guest or move to another topic. They'd try to act like everything was normal. But everyone in that studio knew something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Sunny would probably double down later. She usually did. She'd go on social media and explain why she was right to ask those questions. She'd have her supporters rally around her. She'd paint herself as the brave truth-teller who got punished for speaking up. But none of that would erase what actually happened. None of that would change the fact that she'd been confrontational when she could have been curious, aggressive when she could have been understanding, dismissive when she could have been respectful. And Mark would probably stay quiet about it. That was his style. Let his actions speak for themselves. Let people make up their own minds. He didn't need to win a Twitter war or write a think piece. He'd said what he needed to say in that moment, and then he'd left. That's the thing about real confrontations versus manufactured ones. When it's real, there's no script to fall back on, no producer to cut to commercial at just the right moment, no chance to redo the take. It just happens, raw and messy and true. And what happened on The View that day was about as raw and true as daytime television gets. A host who thought her moral authority gave her license to attack. A guest who thought he was coming for a friendly chat and found himself in an ambush. And a moment where someone finally said, "Enough is enough." The audience had watched it all with wide eyes and held breath. They'd come expecting light entertainment and celebrity gossip. Instead, they'd witnessed something that would be talked about for years. A real moment. A real clash. A real breaking point. As Mark walked through the backstage area, past confused crew members and gawking staff, he didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted. Because standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, even when it might cost you something, always feels better than sitting there and taking it. And Sunny, sitting at that table trying to regain her composure, had to reckon with something she probably hadn't expected. That her tactics, her approach, her self-assured certainty had finally pushed someone too far. That not everyone was going to play along. That some people value their self-respect more than they value being on television. The show would recover. It always did. But Sunny's reputation had taken a hit it wouldn't soon forget. Because millions of people had just watched her be cruel and dismissive, and then act shocked when someone had the audacity to stand up to her. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about privilege. It wasn't about any of the buzzwords Sunny had tried to use to justify her behavior. It was about something much simpler and much more fundamental. It was about treating people with basic human decency. About recognizing that everyone has a story, a journey, struggles you know nothing about. About approaching conversations with at least a minimal amount of good faith. Sunny had failed that basic test, and Mark had passed it. He'd tried. He'd engaged. He'd explained. And when it became clear that none of that mattered, that Sunny was more interested in scoring points than understanding him, he'd made the only choice that made sense. He left. And in doing so, he'd turned what was supposed to be Sunny's moment of moral superiority into a masterclass in dignity and self-respect. You don't have to sit there and be someone's punching bag just because they think they're fighting for something important. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to leave. You're allowed to decide that your peace of mind matters more than playing along with someone else's agenda. The whole thing had lasted maybe 15 minutes from start to finish. But those 15 minutes had crystallized something that a lot of people had been feeling for a while. That somewhere along the way, conversation had turned into combat. That nuance had been replaced with gotchas. That trying to understand someone had been replaced with trying to destroy them. And Mark Wahlberg, of all people, had drawn a line in the sand. Not with a carefully crafted statement. Not with a social media post. But by simply standing up and walking away. It was one of the most dramatic moments in talk show history. Not because of what was said, though plenty was said, but because of what it represented. A rejection of performative outrage. A rejection of bad faith argumentation. A rejection of the idea that anyone with a platform has the right to treat others however they want. Sunny had learned a hard lesson that day. Or maybe she hadn't learned it at all. Time would tell. But whether she learned from it or not, the moment itself would stand as a reminder. Treat people with respect. Approach conversations with humility. Remember that the person sitting across from you is a human being with feelings and dignity and a story you don't fully understand. And if you forget those things, don't be surprised when people stop wanting to talk to you.